You know, we make agreements all the time, every single day. From something as simple as promising a friend you'll meet for coffee, to something as big as signing a lease on an apartment or accepting a new job. We're constantly making what feel like contracts.
But what's the secret sauce? What's that invisible line that turns a casual promise into something a court will actually enforce? Well, it's not as simple as just a handshake or a signature. It all comes down to one absolutely critical ingredient.
Okay, so let's get into it. The very starting point is this idea of consent, which we find in Section 13. All it means is that everybody involved has to be on the exact same page, about the exact same thing. There's a fancy Latin term for it, consensus ad idem, which just means a meeting of minds. If I think I'm selling you my Maruti Swift, but you think you're buying my i10, see the problem? Our minds haven't met. There's no consent, so there's no contract.
But here's the thing, and this is really the core of our whole explainer today. For that agreement to actually hold up in court, just having consent isn't enough. That meeting of minds has to be genuine. It has to be free.
So check this out. This flowchart is basically our roadmap. Think of consent as the starting line and a valid contract as the finish line. But see those 5 obstacles? You can think of them as contract killers. They're the things that can completely derail the whole agreement, and we're going to break down every single one.
So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the absolute heart of the matter, defining what free consent even is. Then we'll get into the heavy stuff, the pressure tactics of coercion and undue influence. After that, we'll look at the sneaky side of things, fraud and misrepresentation. Then we'll cover what happens when everyone's just plain wrong, which is called mistake. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by looking at the aftermath. What does it mean for a contract to be void versus voidable?
All right, let's jump right in. Section 1, the heart of a contract. This is where we lock in that core definition of free consent. So what exactly is free consent? Well, Section 14 of the Indian Contract Act does something interesting. It actually defines it by what it's not. It's basically a checklist. Your consent is free only if it wasn't caused by one of these 5 things you see on the screen: coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, or mistake. If none of those are present, then and only then is your consent considered truly free.
Okay, let's dive into our first 2 contract killers. I like to group these together as pressure tactics. We're talking about coercion and undue influence. Think of it as 2 ways to force someone's hand. One is like a punch, and the other is more like a subtle but powerful push.
First up, coercion, which is laid out in Section 15. This is the really obvious, blatant one. It's about forcing someone into a deal through threats. The law breaks it down into 2 main things. Either you commit, or threaten to commit, an act that's illegal under the Indian Penal Code, physical harm. Or you illegally hold on to someone's property, or threaten to, until they give in and sign the contract. And this example makes it crystal clear, right? This isn't a negotiation. It's a demand backed by a horrible criminal threat. A is forcing B to agree by threatening to kidnap his son. B might say yes, but that consent is worthless in the eyes of the law because it was obtained through coercion. Now, let me tell you about a real case that's just heartbreaking but so important legally. In Ranganayakama versus Alwarsetti, a 13-year-old girl had just become a widow. Her relatives put her in an impossible situation. They refused to allow her husband's body to be taken for cremation, a deeply important ritual, unless she agreed to adopt a boy. The court saw right through this. It wasn't a physical threat, but it was immense emotional and psychological pressure, and obstructing a cremation is an unlawful act. Her consent was coerced. So coercion is all about that brute force. Now, let's switch gears to its more subtle cousin, undue influence. As you can see here, we're shifting from physical pressure to mental and moral pressure. We're going from threatening someone's body to overpowering their will. Section 16 defines undue influence, and really, you got to look for 2 key things. First, one person has to be in a position of power over the other, where they can dominate their will. And second, and this is crucial, they have to use that power to get an unfair deal. It's not just about having influence, it's about abusing it. So you might be asking, when does the law start to get suspicious? Well, in 3 types of situations, the court will automatically presume that undue influence might be at play. First, where there's clear authority, like a cop and an accused person. Second, in what's called a fiduciary relationship. That's just any relationship built on trust, like a doctor and patient or a teacher and student. And third, when someone's mind isn't at its sharpest because of old age, sickness, or distress. Okay, this table right here, this is pure gold for your exams. Let's walk through it real quick. The nature, like we said, is physical for coercion, mental for undue influence. A big one is criminality. Coercion often involves an actual crime, while undue influence usually doesn't. And look at the parties. Coercion can come from a total stranger, a hired thug maybe, but for undue influence, you need that pre-existing relationship, because that's where the power comes from.
All right, we've moved past pressure tactics. Now we're getting into the world of deception. In this section, the problem isn't that someone's will was forced, it's that their consent was based on lies or bad information. We're talking fraud and misrepresentation.
Let's start with the one that's a bit less, well, evil, you could say. Misrepresentation. Under Section 18, this is basically an honest mistake. It's when you tell someone something that's not true, but you genuinely believe it is. You have zero intention of ripping them off.
This example is perfect. A tells B his car gets great mileage, and he honestly thinks it does. Maybe that's what he was told, or he just misread the specs. He's not trying to lie. But B buys the car based on that info. Since the statement was false, but made innocently, it's a classic case of misrepresentation.
And now, fraud, under Section 17. The key, the absolute game-changing word here is intent. Fraud isn't an accident. It's deception on purpose. It's when you actively lie or hide a crucial fact with the single goal of tricking someone into signing on the dotted line.
This brings up a super common question and a really tricky one. Can you commit fraud just by not saying anything? Can silence be a lie? Well, the law's pretty nuanced on this.
So here's the deal. As a general rule, just keeping your mouth shut is not fraud. The law follows the principle of caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. It's kind of on you to ask the right questions. But, and this is a huge but, there are exceptions. In some cases, you have a duty to speak. Think about those relationships of trust we talked about, or when you're buying insurance. In those situations, you have to disclose everything important. And if you don't, then your silence is absolutely considered fraud.
And here it is, the money slide for this section, another fantastic one for exam prep. The biggest difference is intention and belief. With fraud, you know you're lying and you mean to deceive. With misrepresentation, you don't. And this leads to totally different outcomes. If you're a victim of fraud, you can cancel the contract and sue for damages. With misrepresentation, usually you can only cancel the contract. It's a massive difference.
Okay, we've covered pressure and we've covered deception. Our last factor is totally different. In this case, there's no villain. No one's trying to trick or force anyone. Instead, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding. Let's talk about the doctrine of mistake.
First things first, we got to split mistake into two big buckets, mistake of law and mistake of fact. If you make a mistake about the law of the land, tough luck. The rule is ignorance of the law is no excuse, so the contract usually stands. But if you make a mistake about a key fact of the agreement, now that's a different story. That can absolutely impact the contract. So first, we have what's called a bilateral mistake. Bi means two, right? This is when both parties are mistaken about the exact same essential fact. Because you both agreed to something that wasn't actually true, there was never a real meeting of minds. And the consequence here is huge. The agreement is completely void. Not voidable, void. It's like it never even happened.
So what kind of mistakes are we talking about here? Well, it has to be about something fundamental, like a mistake about the very existence of the thing. You agree to sell me a car that, unknown to both of us, was destroyed in a fire yesterday. Or a mistake about who owns it. You agree to buy a piece of land that it turns out you already own. Or even the quality. We both think we're dealing with a Picasso, but it's just a cheap fake. In all these cases, the agreement is void.
Okay, but what happens if only one of you is mistaken? That's a unilateral mistake. For example, you think that painting is a Picasso, but the seller knows it's a fake and just keeps quiet. Well, the general rule is the contract is probably still valid. The law basically says it's on you to do your homework. Your mistake doesn't automatically let you out of the deal.
But you knew there was a but coming, right? There are a couple of huge exceptions where a one-sided mistake will kill the contract. First, if you're mistaken about the actual identity of the person you're dealing with, and that identity is super important, like you think you're hiring a world-famous surgeon, but it's an imposter. Second, if you're mistaken about the very nature of the contract you're signing. In those rare situations, even a unilateral mistake can make the contract void.
All right, so we've gone through all 5 of those contract killers. Now let's get to the really practical part. So what? What happens next? This is all about the consequences, the remedies, and understanding that huge legal difference between a void contract and a voidable one.
This chart just lays it all out for us, plain and simple. The first 4 issues, coercion, undue influence, fraud, and misrepresentation, all lead to a voidable contract. But that last one, a bilateral mistake about a key fact, makes the agreement completely void from the start. And believe me, those 2 words mean very different things.
So what does voidable actually mean? It means the innocent person, the one who is pressured or deceived, gets to call all the shots. They have a choice. They can decide to affirm the contract and just go ahead with it. Or they can choose to rescind it, which means cancel it. And if they do cancel, they just have to give back whatever they got out of the deal. It's called restitution. Simple as that.
And so we come all the way back to where we started. We know that every contract needs a meeting of minds. But as you've seen today, the really important question, the one that decides everything, isn't just if your minds met, but how. Was that meeting genuine? Was it voluntary? Or was it clouded by pressure, by lies, or by a massive misunderstanding? That question is the very essence of free consent.